Hello, friends. I wanted to share with you a game that I played last night live on chess.com. This was a blitz game, 5-0 time control, so no increment. And it was a really fun game. I sacrificed my whole queen and a rook to get to this amazing end game where I had an amazing Zugzwang on my opponent. And let me just show it to you guys. So, started off with d4. I develop my knight and contest the central pawns with d5. My opponent develops the bishop, pinning my knight, which is undermining my defense over d5. So I just continue on with c5, develop my other knight, captures on d5, and now here he takes my knight. So typically when the pawn takes, I'm pretty happy as this opens up my light square diagonal. However, at this moment, after taking, I am left with the decision to take with the queen or with the pawn, because the queen is currently defending my pawn on d5. So my opponent saw this and realized that I did not deal with this pin very well. In fact, maybe I should have played bishop to e7 here to break this pin so that my queen recapture doesn't take away a defender of d5. So, at this point, if I take with the queen, the knight will retake with tempo on the queen, and I'll have to come back. And I see all of this, and it's probably fine, but I don't want to be down a pawn, especially not the d5 pawn. So I take back, and I've actually ruined my kingside pawn structure, which is unfortunate, but at least I still have d5. So it takes, and instead of retaking right away, this does open up the d file for my opponent's queen, so he is attacking d5 yet again. So I decide to defend this, and it's going to be hard for white to hold on to this pawn, so they let me recapture with the bishop. And here my opponent is getting ready for a fianchetto to castle kingside, and I decide to develop my queen with a punch at b2 and just getting on this diagonal with the bishop. And here, my opponent makes a really strange decision. After playing g3, they play bishop to d3, which doesn't really make a lot of sense considering that they just play g3 and the bishop would like to go to g2. Now, I grab this pawn. They did have this move earlier, but I did have some check to give. So only now do they decide to play knight a4, and I still give the check. So if they give the knight to d2 blocking, I take with the bishop, queen takes, and then I take the rook here. So they can't really block this. So they have to move the king. They decide to go to f1. Now we see why it's so awkward for the bishop to be on d3, because now I have bishop h3 check, forcing the king even deeper. And this is where the king will stay for the remainder of the game, locking in the rook on h1. So these pieces are essentially trapped by my one bishop. So now I address the threat of the knight attacking my queen. Here he pins my knight to my king, another bishop move, but also opening up the d file for the queen again. Here I decide to castle long and defend my d pawn with the rook. And here, takes. Now, this bishop was also defending the knight, so the queen is now protecting the knight. And the queen can't move too far away, is what I'm getting at. Here is a strong move. Knight is attacking c6, and I was actually considering how I should defend this. If I bring up the king, then rook c1 makes a lot of sense. And I guess I would have to move a piece. I was also thinking about c5, but I figured the knight was also coming in somewhere to attack my queen, which was unfortunate. So if knight here, that drops the knight here. So I was mostly concerned about knight b5. That's why I couldn't push c5, which made a lot of sense, defending the pawn, the bishop, and attacking the knight, but I don't want to give up b5. So I lifted my rook here, defending c6. And again, rook c1 just makes a lot of sense, piling up. And I could have potentially moved my king at this point, but again, I think knight b5 is a pretty big threat. So maybe king d7 made a lot of sense. Getting off this pen, making sure the pawn could recapture, and also just defending. But after the rook left, I decided to grab this pawn, and I think that might have been a mistake because knight takes is pretty strong, actually. So at this point, I decided to alleviate a lot of this pressure. You know, the bishop is hanging, and that would be with a really strong threat. In fact, he's got a lot of discoveries with the rook and the knight. So even if I save the bishop, there's still this idea, right? Attacking the queen, unleashing the rook. Yeah, I just didn't want to deal with any of this, so I just sacked the exchange here. Rook takes with check, king up, and now my queen has another purpose. After taking a2, is not just a pawn grab, but it's also defending d5. So the queen can't just take this, and I'm luckily not getting checkmated right away. So after I move the king out of check, the rook is under attack. So my opponent decided to get a little tricky here, actually. With rook c2 is actually the best recommended move by the computer. Attacking the queen. Now, where exactly does my queen go? If I go here, or anywhere on this diagonal for that matter, there's a rook discovery on c7, unleashing the queen's attack on this diagonal. So if I want to defend this pawn, I'm going to lose the queen. So I can't move the queen to save the pawn. I could go here to save the queen, but again, queen takes is very powerful. My king is caught in no man's land with a lot of heavy pieces raining down on my king's side, with an additional knight potentially landing some checks as well in some lines. So I decide I'm going to sack the queen, not for the rook, but for the knight and the rook. I take the knight, knowing that rook c7 will come, but I looked at this position and I thought to myself, you know, that's a lot of material for the queen, right? Because this rook might as well not even be on the board. In fact, the fact that the rook is on the board is more detrimental to white than as if white took the rook off the board, because that would at least be another square that the king can utilize and move to. So in this endgame, I develop my rook. So I have a rook and two bishops basically against the queen. So to me, this was a pretty good trade, although it likes white's position a lot. But I'm looking at a lot of mating ideas. And if these pawns ever move, this bishop will become a very strong piece on this diagonal. So my opponent grabs a pawn. I could have played a5 in this last move, which hunkers down the pawn and the bishop, but I really wanted to get this rook involved, so I decided to let them take with check. I'm blocked with the rook, attacking the queen, and now the queen comes all the way back, anticipating some back rank issues. So I know that if my opponent wants to ever move his king out, or his rook for that matter, he has to make space on f2. So he wants to move these pawns eventually, and so my job is to prevent him from doing that. So what do? I play bishop to c5. Makes a lot of sense. In fact, if this pawn moves now, bishop takes on e3 is checkmate. So my opponent decides to pin my bishop to my king, and I move out of the pin and defend my bishop. And only now does my opponent play f3. So I cannot take here because the queen is defending it. But at this point, I think that the evaluation already swings in black's favor, because I should be at least winning the queen back by a move like rook to b1, pinning the queen to the king. And again, this queen is necessary to defend the pawn. So they cannot even take on b1, as this is checkmate. So what ends up happening is, instead of rook b1, allowing the king's escape to f2, defending the queen with the rook, which is probably still winning for black because 2 bishops will be better than the lone rook. I still have very weak pawns on the king side, and my opponent has a very healthy pawn structure. I decide to play the more ambitious, and I believe the stronger move, rook to b2. Just deciding to cut off this f2 square from the king. Now, I'm not even getting any material back besides this pawn for the queen. This is just a free rook. But after bishop takes e3, the only legal move is to block with the queen. And the plan is not to take this queen. I'm not going to take this because, again, that's what my opponent wants. King f2, freeing the rook. Because we get into that endgame, it's going to be a rook versus a bishop, and a healthy pawn structure versus a very weak pawn structure. So in that endgame, I'm pretty confident that white would be favored in that position. So I'm not going to take. So obviously, I have to defend my bishop, as I don't want queen to take. I play d4 here, defending the bishop. And now if queen takes, pawn takes, this pawn takes over f2, and again, the king is completely entombed here, unable to move. So my opponent doesn't want to do this. Instead, what else can they do? The king has no legal moves, the rook has no legal moves, the h-pawn has no legal moves. The queen can only take the bishop, which again they don't want to do. So now they have 2 pieces to work with, and they're both pawns. So they push, and now I have the luxury and time to make some king moves of my own. And what I want to do is get up, defend the bishop, and after this pawn push, I am now able to come into e4, defending the bishop, and now I can push this pawn, right? And now if the queen takes here, king takes, and the king's taking over f2, and this pawn is walking all the way to d1, promoting with checkmate. So again, my opponent just pushed some pawns, or takes. I believe in the game they pushed. I can push again. Now if they take, I just promote. And again, if they take here, king takes, they take. And notice, if it was white to move here, it would actually be a stalemate, as they have no legal moves. But luckily, it's black to move, promote to either queen or rook, and it's a beautiful checkmate. Now, why does the title say this is my worst loss if I won this game? Well, it's because I lied. I didn't actually play d3 when I was defending the bishop with the king. Instead, I mistakenly, in time pressure, played king to d3, blocking my pawn. And I have nowhere to go. Even though the queen is pinned, it's not like I can bring the king in and push the pawn. But I didn't even need the king to protect the pawn for promotion. All I needed was the king to protect the bishop. So this was actually a very unfortunate miss in my game. I played this king d3 line, and it is stalemate in this line because only after I realized my mistake, I bring the king back, and now my opponent captures, and I'm way too far away from promoting, and then in fact I'm in check, and no matter how I take back, it's going to be that stalemate that I showed earlier. So this was very unfortunate. In fact, if I try to avoid the stalemate, I'm very much losing this game because my bishop is also under attack. So I just had to take. There's nothing else to do, and my opponent escaped with the draw. And even though a draw isn't a loss, this very much felt like a loss for me, knowing that I had such a beautiful game and that I had the win just a few moves away. I missed this mate in 4. So that was very unfortunate, but I still had a lot of fun playing it, and hope you guys liked it too and learned something. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.